We are Victorious Kids.
Welcome, we are Victorious Kids.
Welcome, we are Victorious Kids.
Welcome.
Yes.
We are Victorious Kids.
No matter what I'm gonna face tomorrow. I bet my life on everything you say. You turn the light on, now I see forever. The path is clearer out in front of me. I put one foot in front of the other, keeping my eyes on you. My life following Jesus, I trust you, I trust you. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. No matter what I'm gonna face tomorrow. I bet my life on everything you say. Turn the light on, now I see forever. The path is clearer out in front of me. I put one foot in front of the other, keeping my eyes on you. My life following Jesus, I trust you, I trust you. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break. As the world shakes and things break. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything. As the world shakes and things break, you are my rock, my everything.
After Joshua died, the Israelites disobeyed God. They did not obey God's laws, and they did not drive out the rest of the Canaanites from the Promised Land. The Israelites began to worship the Canaanite gods instead of Yahweh, the true God. The Israelites had no king, so everyone did what they thought was right for themselves. By disobeying God, the Israelites started a pattern that repeated several times. The pattern went like this. The Israelites would disobey God for several years. Then He would punish them by allowing their enemies to defeat them. These enemies would steal things from the Israelites, destroy their property, and kill many of them. Then after Israel's enemies oppressed them for many years, the Israelites would repent of their sin and ask God to rescue them. Each time the Israelites repented, God would rescue them. He did this by providing a deliverer, a person who would fight against their enemies and defeat them. Then there would be peace in the land, and the deliverer would rule over them well. God sent many deliverers to rescue the people. God did this again after He allowed the Midianites, a nearby enemy people group, to defeat the Israelites. The Midianites took all of the Israelites' crops for 7 years. The Israelites were so scared they hid in caves so the Midianites would not find them. Finally, they cried out to God to save them. There was an Israelite man named Gideon. One day, he was threshing grain in a hidden place so the Midianites would not steal it. The angel of Yahweh came to Gideon and said, "God is with you, mighty warrior. Go and save Israel from the Midianites." Gideon's father had an altar dedicated to an idol. The first thing God told Gideon to do was to tear down that altar. But Gideon was afraid of the people, so he waited until nighttime. Then he tore down the altar and smashed it to pieces. He built a new altar to God nearby and made a sacrifice to God on it. The next morning, the people saw that someone had torn down and destroyed the altar, and they were very angry. They went to Gideon's house to kill him. But Gideon's father said, "Why are you trying to help your God? If he is a god, let him protect himself." Because he said this, the people did not kill Gideon. Then the Midianites came again to steal from the Israelites. There were so many of them that they could not be counted. Gideon called the Israelites together to fight them. Gideon asked God for 2 signs so he could be sure that God was really telling him to save Israel. For the first sign, Gideon laid a sheepskin on the ground and asked God to let the morning dew fall only on the sheepskin and not on the ground. God did that. The next night, he asked that the ground be wet, but the sheepskin dry. God did that too. Because of these 2 signs, Gideon believed that God really wanted him to save Israel from the Midianites. Then Gideon called for soldiers to come to him, and 32,000 men came. But God told him this was too many. So Gideon sent home 22,000, all who were afraid to fight. God told Gideon that he still had too many men. So Gideon sent all of them home except for 300 soldiers. That night, God told Gideon, "Go down to the Midianite camp and listen to them talk. When you hear what they say, you will no longer be afraid to attack them." So that night, Gideon went down to the camp and heard a Midianite soldier telling his friend about something he had dreamed. The man's friend said, "This dream means that Gideon's army will defeat us, the Midianite army." When Gideon heard this, he worshipped God. Then Gideon returned to his soldiers and gave each of them a horn, a clay pot, and a torch. They surrounded the camp where the Midianite soldiers were sleeping. Gideon's 300 soldiers had the torches in the pots, so the Midianites could not see the light of the torches. Then all of Gideon's soldiers broke their pots at the same moment, suddenly revealing the fire of the torches. They blew their horns and shouted, "A sword for Yahweh and for Gideon!" God confused the Midianites so that they started attacking and killing each other. Immediately, Gideon sent messengers to call many other Israelites to come from their homes and help chase the Midianites. They killed many of them and chased the rest of them out of the Israelites' land. 120,000 Midianites died that day. This is how God saved Israel. The people wanted to make Gideon their king. Gideon did not allow them to do this, but he asked them for some of the gold rings that each of them had taken from the Midianites. The people gave Gideon a large amount of gold. Then Gideon used the gold to make a special garment like the high priest used to wear, but the people started worshiping it as if it were an idol. So God punished Israel again because they worshipped idols. God allowed their enemies to defeat them. They finally asked God for help again, and God sent them another deliverer to rescue them. This same thing happened many times. The Israelites would sin, God would punish them, they would repent, and God would send someone to rescue them. Over many years, God sent many deliverers who saved the Israelites from their enemies. Finally, the people asked God for a king like all the other nations had. They wanted a king who was tall and strong, and who could lead them into battle. God did not like this request, but he gave them a king just as they had asked. Saul was the first king of Israel. He was tall and handsome, just like the people wanted. Saul was a good king for the first few years that he ruled over Israel, but then he became a wicked man who did not obey God. So God chose a different man who would one day be king in his place. God chose a young Israelite named David and began to prepare him to one day become king after Saul. David was a shepherd from the town of Bethlehem. At different times, David killed both a lion and a bear that attacked his father's sheep while David was watching them. David was a humble and righteous man. He trusted and obeyed God. When David was still a young man, he fought against a giant named Goliath. Goliath was a very good soldier. He was very strong and about 3 meters tall. But God helped David kill Goliath and save Israel. After that, David won many victories over Israel's enemies. David became a great soldier, and he led Israel's army in many battles. The people praised him very much. The people loved David so much that King Saul became jealous of him. Finally, Saul wanted to kill him. So David ran away into the wilderness to hide from him and his soldiers. One day, when Saul and his soldiers were looking for him, Saul went into a cave. It was the same cave that David was hiding in, but Saul did not see him. David went up very close behind Saul and cut off a piece of his clothing. Later, after Saul left the cave, David shouted to him to look at the cloth he was holding. In this way, Saul knew that David refused to kill him to become king. Sometime later, Saul died in battle, and David became king of Israel. He was a good king, and the people loved him. God blessed David and made him successful. David fought many battles, and God helped him defeat Israel's enemies. David conquered the city of Jerusalem and made it his capital city, where he lived and ruled. David was king for 40 years. During this time, Israel became powerful and wealthy. David wanted to build a temple where all the Israelites could worship God and offer him sacrifices. For about 400 years, the people had been worshiping God and offering sacrifices to him at the tent of meeting that Moses had made. But there was a prophet named Nathan. God sent him to tell David this: "You have fought in many wars, so you will not build this temple for me. Your son will build it. But still, I will greatly bless you. One of your descendants will rule as king over my people forever." The only descendant of David who could rule forever was the Messiah. The Messiah was God's chosen one, who would save the people of the world from their sin. When David heard Nathan's message, he thanked God and praised him. God was honoring him and giving him many blessings. Of course, David did not know when God would do those things. We know now that the Israelites would have to wait a long time before the Messiah came, almost 1,000 years. David ruled his people justly for many years. He obeyed God very much, and God blessed him. However, Toward the end of his life, he sinned terribly against God. One day, David looked out from his palace and saw a beautiful woman bathing. He did not know her, but he found out that her name was Bathsheba. Instead of looking away, David sent someone to bring her to him. He slept with her and sent her back home. A short time later, Bathsheba sent a message to David saying that she was pregnant. Bathsheba's husband was a man named Uriah. He was one of David's best soldiers. He was away fighting in a war at this time. David called Uriah back from the battle and told him to go be with his wife. But Uriah refused to go home while the rest of the soldiers were in battle. So David sent Uriah back to the battle and told the general to place him where the enemy was strongest so that he would be killed. This is what happened. Uriah died in battle. After Uriah died in the war, David married Bathsheba. Later, she gave birth to David's son. God was very angry about what David had done, so he sent the prophet Nathan to tell David how evil his sin was. David repented of his sin, and God forgave him. For the rest of his life, David followed and obeyed God, even in difficult times. But David's baby boy died. This is how God punished David. Also, until David died, some people in his own family fought against him, and David lost much power. But God was faithful and still did what he had promised David he would do for him, even though David had disobeyed him. Later, David and Bathsheba had another son, and they named him Solomon.
So, if you lived in ancient Israel, one of the most important places was the tabernacle.
The tabernacle was a sacred tent that the Israelites carried as they journeyed to the promised land.
And it was sacred because it's where the heavenly presence of Israel's God lived on earth. And the tabernacle had an important design to show just how special it was. There's the outer courtyard, then an entry room into the tent, and it leads into the center of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, God's personal throne room, and it's guarded by these heavenly hybrid creatures called cherubim. Notice, the closer that you get to the center, the more sacred the space becomes.
The people who work in the tabernacle are called priests, and they care for the sacred space, offer sacrifices on behalf of Israel, and announce God's blessing over the people.
Yeah, these priests represent God to the people, and they represent the people to God. So think of both the tabernacle and the priests who work in it like gateways that link together heaven and earth. And this is why the tabernacle was eventually brought up to settle on a mountain, because mountains are where earth meets heaven. Now, one thing that's missing in this tabernacle that you would find in every other ancient holy space are idol images that physically represent the God.
Oh, right. Israel's God explicitly commanded them to not make any idol images.
And that's because in the Bible, all humanity is God's image. This is what we learn in the first pages of the Bible, where Adam and Eve, in Hebrew their names mean human and life, they're called God's image, which means they represent God in his holy space.
And that holy space is a garden in a land called Eden.
Yes, and the story is designed to show that Eden is the reality that the later tabernacle symbolized and pointed back to. For example, look close at the descriptions of Eden. There's the larger region on the land that's called Eden, but then within Eden, God plants a garden. And then in the center of that garden, God plants the tree of life.
The design of Eden matches the tabernacle design.
Yes, and there are details in the Eden story that are developed much later in the Bible showing how Eden is on a high mountain.
Because they're in a place where earth meets heaven.
Exactly. And God tells these humans to work and to keep the garden. These are the same words that are used later in the Bible to describe what priests do in the tabernacle.
So Adam and Eve are God's image and are like priests working and worshiping in a type of heaven on earth temple.
Yes, they represent creation before God, and as God's image, they represent God to all of creation. And they do all of this in this sacred space that's saturated with the life and presence of God. And so God tells them to rule creation on his behalf. They're like priests who embody God's heavenly wisdom and rule here on earth.
You could call them royal priests.
Exactly. Now, this whole setup, the royal priests in God's presence where there's abundance and life, in the book of Genesis, this is called God's blessing.
But it doesn't last very long.
No. Humanity is deceived by this rebellious creature. They're unsatisfied with being images of God, and so they make a grab at being God, ruling creation on their own terms.
And so God exiles them from the garden.
And God places cherubim at the door of Eden to guard the way back in.
This is tragic. Humanity has given up the role God made them for.
But it's not the end. The rest of the biblical story is about God's mission to undo this tragedy so that humans can regain access to the heaven on earth place where they can finally become God's royal priests. It all begins with a promise that God makes to Adam and Eve that he will raise up one of their descendants to rule over and defeat that deceiver. God says that this coming descendant will strike the head of that deceiver, but also be struck by it.
So this priestly figure will restore God's blessing by offering up his own life like a sacrifice. But this is still just a promise.
Yes, and so in the next story, we find the next generation outside of Eden. Two brothers at the door of the garden are offering sacrifices to God, kind of like priests.
Maybe God will accept these offerings and they can get back into Eden.
But sadly, one brother, Cain, gets angry because God favors his brother Abel's sacrifice, and so Cain murders his own brother. Then Cain is exiled even further from Eden and from God's blessing. And over time, Cain's anger plunges humanity into widespread violence.
Humans really need that coming royal priest to rescue them.
Yes, and that's the hope that this whole story is designed to generate. And so in the next few videos, we're going to explore the theme of this coming royal priest throughout the story of the Bible. We're going to see how the stories of Abraham and Moses and David all point forward to Jesus, who is the ultimate royal priest.
Jesus, the one who will restore the blessings of Eden.
So that all humanity can become the royal priests that we're made to be, ruling the world together on God's behalf.